I'm talking today about human development in practice, lessons from 40 years' experience. And it's a big topic. And this is what I'm going to try and cover, which is a lot in a short time. I'm going to briefly talk about the origins of human development, which is essentially the lecture I gave last year, but that took the whole time. And then I'm going to be looking at what progress has been made over the decades and come to some conclusions and make some suggestions about what are the outstanding important issues for the future. So starting with the evolution of ideas, and we normally start sort of like after the Second World War when countries became independent, and growth maximization was certainly the dominant focus. And over the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was pretty successful, and investment rose, and import substitution successfully built up industrialization in many countries. But there were deep flaws in it. And the deep flaws took the form of the fact that the human aspects were under-focused on. Yeah, there was rapid growth, but poverty was still very high and rising. Inequality was high. There wasn't enough employment. So there are a whole lot of deficiencies of looking at only GMP. And that's why there was a move towards looking at alternative objectives. Because GMP neglects income distribution, and it can be consistent with high and rising poverty. It neglects the environment, which wasn't an issue then, but is now. And it neglects agency goals. So there was many reasons to move on. And a series of different approaches followed, human-centered approaches. They didn't take the form of human development, but they all had in their essence some of the things that we recognize as human development today. For example, the first one was a focus on employment, which has come right back into the forefront of discussions. Redistribution with growth was an important agenda, focusing on inequality, which again is a very current issue. Basic needs, that was an approach which focused on meeting poor people's basic needs and has a lot in common with the multidimensional poverty index and the policies involved in that. And then, of course, Amartya Sen's capabilities approach, which I needn't say more about because this whole conference is about that. Well, those all took place in the 1970s in reaction to the, some of the failures of the previous strategy. But then in the 1980s, there was an overwhelming debt crisis, which really put everything else to the back burner. And from then on, human goals were displaced, and the emphasis was on, very familiar, austerity, debt, stabilization. And that in itself, of course, brought its own problems, including even worse poverty, poor human indicators, high unemployment, and so on. And so it was at that stage that people involved in the capabilities approach, Amartya Sen particularly, and people involved in the basic needs approach, which includes me and various other people, we came together and we, led by a brilliant Pakistani economist called Mahbub, formed the first human development report, wrote the first human development report, and really forged the human development approach, arising out of discussions that have been going on in round tables around the world in the 1980s. So I'm now coming to what is human development, rushing through this so I can get on to what's been happening over the last 40 years. And I just quote from the first report, which puts it very succinctly. Human development is a process of enlarging people's choices. And then the most critical ones are to lead a long and healthy life, to be educated to enjoy a decent standard of living. And additional choices include political freedom, guaranteed human rights, and self-respect. So that covers really covers the basic ingredients of human development. Of course, the Kant quotation is very important. So act as to treat humanity, whether in their own person or that of any other, in every case as an end and never as a means. So humans are the end of the development process. So whereas you might say in a nutshell, those people who put emphasis on economic growth regard humans as very useful instruments to achieve the economic growth. Those people who put emphasis on human development regard economic growth as a very useful instrument for enlarging human development, but by no means the only useful instrument. So human development goes well beyond material aspects, as you could see from the quote I just made. And just to specify, it includes political freedoms and participation, freedom from insecurity of many types, freedom to enjoy cultural diversity, community well-being, social relations, good social relations, a healthy environment, and justice. And I'm sure everyone here could add something to that list. There are many ways of achieving a list, and different people have different approaches. But one way that I did in previous collaborative work, was simply to go through a whole lot of philosophers' work over the ages, drawing to some extent on Sabina Al-Kar, but adding to it. And it produced a very interesting list of 10, 11 different things that you might say have over the ages been thought to constitute the good life and indeed human flourishing, human development. Now let me come briefly to the measurement of human development. It's been measured historically by the Human Development Index, and that is a very reductionist measure. It includes education, years of schooling and literacy, health, measured usually by life expectancy, and income per head, but not in its uncorrected form, but first of all, purchasing power parity, income per head when you're looking across countries, and secondly, adjusted in a variety of ways, so rich countries' income counts less than poor. And currently it's adjusted by logging the income. But that's only the sort of what you might say the basic elements of human development. And as I've just said, there are a whole lot of other ones. And research shows that the non-HDI dimensions are not all that well correlated with the HDI dimensions. So we do need to look at those separately. We can't just say they're encompassed. Incidentally, the same research shows that they're even less well related to income per head. They're slightly better related to the basic human development. So we need to look at the broader dimensions. And just to give you one example of that, this is a scatter diagram relating trust in others, which is an important dimension of human development, to the Human Development Index. And you can see across countries at a particular point in time in 2005, and you can see that there is some sort of correlation, but it's very weak. And that's true of many of the other dimensions. Well, now I'm coming to the central part of this paper, which is what has been happening to human development as I've defined it, not just the narrow but also the broader dimensions, but I'm going to be looking at the narrow dimension first. What's been happening to that in the long period since the concept was evolved, and indeed before. Although actually most of the data I'm going to be using is from 1980. And the reason I have selected 1980 is because that's the first date for which we have a consistent series of the Human Development Index. Some people have concocted one going back to 70, but it's not very consistent and produces odd results. So I've been using the 1980 data. So what we find is big improvements, and I think one must emphasize this, that the basic human development has seen big improvements over the last 40 years or what have you. So from 1950 to 2012, that's of course even more years, Africa's life expectancy rose from 36 to 58, Asia's from 42 to 70, and Latin America 56 to 74. In education, low-income countries moved from having half their children educated to having 100% in primary education, and from just 14% in secondary to 57%. And middle-income countries, which already had more or less universal primary education, moved from 16% of secondary school to 77%. So big improvements on these basic elements, and we come now to per capita incomes, the third element. And in low-income countries, income per head rose by 100%, doubled. Middle income countries by 150%, and high income countries by 3/4. So we can say there's major progress on average. And then if we look at it decade by decade, you can see from that there's been progress in every decade. I think if one looks very carefully, one sees some slowdown in the 1980s, the debt crisis era, and you see some acceleration in the 2000s for the low human development countries. And that acceleration particularly reflects, I think, the very good performance of Africa in the 2000s, which itself was probably largely dependent on the primary product boom, and so maybe coming to an end, unfortunately. What about other dimensions? Well, progress on political freedoms, and of course there are many ways of measuring political freedoms, all of which are controversial, but I'm taking Freedom House's index just for convenience. And what you find is that there was progress well, they have three categories of countries: the free countries, what they call the free countries, the partly free countries, and the not free. And it's their language, not mine. I'm not approving it, I'm just presenting it. And what you find here is that there was big progress, but it really came to a halt in the last era, in the 2000s. So that there was progress, and there wasn't any regress in the 2000s, but in every category, having made progress. Of course, the not free actually, having said there was progress in the free. In the partly free and the not free, there was not. There's been some regress. What about homicides, another measure of people's well-being and insecurity? Here you find very big differences according to where you are in the world, in the regions. And you see that the Americas, which consist of just 5 countries in this indicator, are way higher than the other 2 areas in this country, Europe and Asia. And Europe and Asia have seen some improvements, and the Americas, on the whole, are worsening over that time. But then if we look in more detail, and I'm not sure how easy that one is to read, but if we look in more detail by sub-region, we find some regions where things were worsening, but they were pretty good at the beginning, like East Africa or Northern Africa. Some where they're improving, but they were terrible at the beginning, like Southern Africa or Caribbean, and so on and so forth. And then quite a lot of regions to the right-hand side where they were quite low and they've been improving. So it's very difficult to come to any universal conclusion. But I would say on the whole they show some improvement over these decades. We come to armed conflict. We're very aware of armed conflict at the moment, and of course this data doesn't necessarily pick up the very latest. But what is interesting is that coming up to 2014, we do find some decline from a peak in the mid-1990s. There was a rise from about 1950 going up to the 1990s, and then some decline. I think there may be a little bit of a rise now, but I don't know. Now, perhaps the biggest failure has been on the environment. And here, if we take CO2 emissions, there has been an unadulterated failure, if you like, if you take that as a dimension on the environment. If you look at other aspects, they tend to be correlated with that. I mean, most environmental indicators show some worsening, but this one shows a very sharp worsening. Let me just say something about the connection with growth and human development. Over these years, you could investigate, has economic growth been good for human development? Has it been bad for human development? Well, if you think about it a priori, you would expect that growth and human development would go together, because economic growth provides the resources from which people can then, buy more food, governments can spend more on education, and so on and so forth. And in addition, putting it the other way around, you would expect that good human development would contribute to improved economic growth, because when people are better fed, when they're better educated, they're likely to be have higher productivity. So you have a sort of cyclical process which you would expect to happen. with both one feeding into the other and the other feeding. And what this suggests then is that you have, you can have vicious or virtuous cycles of development. In other words, you might have some countries who did very badly on growth, and then they do badly on human development, then they do badly on growth. They get stuck in a sort of low-level, poor, bad performance trap. And then you have other countries where they do very well on both, and they get reinforcing cycles, which supports the progress. And then you might have a third and fourth category, which do well on one aspect and badly on the others. And this diagram shows you, taking the period 1960 to 2000, the relationship between human development and economic growth over a whole series of countries. And the four quadrants show you that the one on the top right-hand corner, the northeast, is where there's a virtuous cycle. The one on the bottom left-hand corner, or the southwest, is a vicious cycle. And then the two others are the lopsided. And what you notice at once from this diagram, first of all, rather depressingly, is an awful lot of countries are in the vicious cycle. In other words, they're doing less well than average, at least, on both growth and human development, and staying there. And then a few countries are in the virtuous cycle. Some countries have done better on human development than economic growth. And then very few countries are in the category of what we call lopsided economic growth, lopsided. In other words, done better on economic growth than human development. And that's in the bottom right-hand corner. So what you find if you look over time, going back to this diagram, and you take this same diagram but look and see how countries progress over time, which I haven't got the diagram here to show you. But what you find is that countries move in and out of the various categories over time. So if you took 10-year bits of time, the countries don't necessarily stay in the same category all the time. Some countries move from the bad vicious cycle category and they move into the human development lopsided. They do better on human development. A few countries move into the economic growth bit. Some countries move from human development lopsided into the virtuous cycle. But the interesting thing is, it's really two facts. First of all, no countries stay decade after decade after decade in the economic growth lopsided position. They always move back into the vicious cycle. They can't stay there. There seems to be something imbalanced about putting everything into economic growth and not having your human development. So you can't stay there, you go back. And the other thing is you always go back. You never move from the economic growth lopsided into the virtuous cycle. There doesn't seem to be a way through. So that is very interesting from the point of view of human development, because assume that this is true, and this is what our research shows, and other people have also shown the same thing. What it means is that you're not going you cannot go for growth and forget about human development, because it's not going to work out. You can go for human development and forget about growth, but you won't get the growth, you'll just be stuck there. But you at least will have your good human development. You can do that, but you can't do it the other way around. So it means that if we even took just a very instrumental view of human development, we only wanted it for its economic growth, which is not what I was saying at the beginning and not what I believe. But if we said that, then we would still say you have to put human development first. And this is very interesting because this is not the way that the economic institutions on the whole function. Generally speaking, the economic institutions argue to countries in difficulties, cut back on your human development expenditures. You can do that when you've got your growth. And they're telling them to do something which isn't going to work. And I'm thinking about, at the moment, Greece, for example, which is the sort of really symbolic or whatever country for an austerity program at the moment. They're being told to do something which is going to actually undermine their growth, not make it better. Okay, so now let me come to trying to explore country experience. I looked in aggregate, and of course these aggregates say we've had a lot of success, but also as I showed you by that diagram, a lot of countries have not done so well. So how about looking in detail at what was the characteristics of the success and what was the characteristics of the failure? And to do that, it's really not easy to select countries if you take the whole lot of countries as one. You need to start by looking at their initial conditions, because obviously the rate of progress that you can have is going to differ according to whether you're very low human development to start with, middle, or high. So what we've done is to categorize countries into, well, it's been done by the Human Development Report, categorize countries into low, medium, and high human development, and then take the best performers in each of those categories. So starting in 1980, which were the best performers in terms of growth of human development, according to the HDI, so this is very HDI-based, and which were the worst. And we get the following for each category. So among the high human development countries, and I suppose there's some surprises, the blues are the successes and the reds are the so-called failures. And I'll continue to use the language of success and failure, but you should see it sort of in inverted commas, because they may well be very successful about other things and so on. And I wouldn't want to say any country is a failure. So less good, better performance. So what you find is that, curiously, Saudi Arabia comes up very high, and Korea and Brazil in the high human development, and then in the not so good in the high human development categories, Jamaica, South Africa, and Congo. So we have a few surprises there and a few expected countries. In the medium human development, and I took here 4 because 2 of them were more or less identical, we have good performance China, Morocco, Turkey, and Iran, and poor performance Togo, Philippines, and Zimbabwe. And then in the low human development countries, good Cambodia, Mali, and Nepal, bad Cote d'Ivoire, CAR, and the Congo, DRC. So what do we expect should be associated with human development success or failure? And that's on the basis of a whole lot of econometric results taking all countries. And what do we find? Well, that doing more social expenditure tends to be good for human development, having good levels of education and good increases, having good female-to-male education enrollments. Then there's the level and growth of per capita income, and then having good income distribution, i.e. more equal income distribution tends to be good for human development, and having low poverty rates. So that's what we expect. And then I want to look at the actual characteristics taking this particular subset of countries. So instead of doing what econometrics would do, is to take the whole category, I just want to pick out the very successful and the worst ones and see what the findings there. On the social expenditure, we find that most good performers saw a large increase in social expenditure. And some particularly, and picking out Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and Nepal. And there were large falls in some poor performers, in Cote d'Ivoire, Congo, CIR, but there were also fall in Iran, so you don't find a universal lesson. Secondary education improved notably among good performers, but it also improved in South Africa, which was a poor one. And the good performers improved their female-to-male secondary ratios more than the poor performers, especially human development in the low human development in countries. So you can see these 2 diagrams show that. May not be too easy to read, but you can see, just contrasting the blue and the red, that the good performers on the whole do better and change in secondary enrollment ratio, and better in the female-male ratio in secondary schools. Now, what about the economic performance? That was on the social side, social inputs. Some good performers had very low per capita incomes in 1980. In the high human development category, Korea had pretty low, and not very low, but had lowish income. China in the medium category had low income. And of course, all the low human development countries also had low incomes, and in fact their incomes were lower than the poor performers in that category. But when it comes to growth, we find variation in performance. I mean, we know, all of us, that China, Korea had very good growth, and they also had good human development. Nepal also had good growth and good human development. But some good HDI countries had bad growth, and we find Saudi Arabia, Iran, Morocco, Mali, Cambodia, none of them had particularly good growth, but they did do well on human development. Among the poor performers, mostly they had poor growth, and many of them had negative growth, but some had reasonable growth. It just shows you how difficult it is to generalize. Jamaica and Philippines seem to have had reasonable growth. So this shows you the annual growth in per capita income, and here you see that the blue performers, on the whole, are outperforming the reds, and in the low category particularly, you have this sharply negative growth among all the poor performers. But on the other hand, Mali also had a negative growth. You can see that growth is broadly related, but not totally consistently related to performance. As far as income distribution is concerned, the good performers mostly were more equal than the poor. But there were two exceptions: Brazil, which we know is notoriously unequal, and also Mali. Although Brazil's income distribution has improved in the 2000s, but it's still pretty poor. And mostly the good performers improved their income distribution more than the poor. And major improvements in income distribution were in Korea, Iran, Cambodia, and Mali. And by the time we come to 2013, most of the good performers had a Gini index of below 4, which is on the equal side, and most of the poor performers had a Gini index of above 4.4. So there is some tendency for income distribution to be related to good and poor performance. And poverty rates were, generally speaking, lower among the among the good performers than the poor performers. So let me now put that together by saying, obviously there isn't a single story, but there is a typology that different countries follow. And what are the typologies of success? And in success, I think we have three typologies. We have ones in which you have growth, which is relatively equitable, and moderate social expenditure, not necessarily very large. And Korea and China would fill that, both growth-led, but they were supported by reasonable amount of social expenditure. And not very unequal. I mean, China by the end was becoming very unequal, but for long periods it was quite equal. Then there's the countries that actually had a social expenditure-led path, and growth didn't perform so much of a role, and inequality was quite high. And we find Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and Morocco, all of that category, all having high social expenditures, leading the success. And then we have the sort of balanced combination of some growth, some equity, and social expenditure, putting those three things together: Turkey and Nepal, and recent experience in Cambodia. What about poor performance? Well, there are those countries which really had very low social expenditure and negative growth. Obviously a message which is going to lead to failure. And the Congo, CAR, and DRC are examples. They're countries that had good social expenditure, but they offset that with negative and inequitable growth, and that was South Africa, negative or low, because South Africa didn't have negative growth, South Africa and Togo. And then countries which had good social expenditure and positive but inequitable growth, Jamaica and Philippines. So we have some sort of different paths that country can take. Let me now move to the non-basic human development. So far I've just looked at the HDI dimensions. Let me move to the beyond the HDI dimensions. The interesting thing is that political freedom isn't particularly related to success. And I'll come to a few country stories at the end, and you'll see that that is the case. So we have countries which do better on the Freedom Index, who are poor performance, than the good performers. The better performers mostly show less gender inequality using the UNDP index, and also, of course, I already talked about the female-male secondary education. So there was a correlation between that and the good and poor performers. On the whole, they have less homicides, but with the exception of Brazil. Now, civil conflict, civil war is an interesting thing, because you might look at my list and you say, well, obviously those poor performers did terribly because they had civil war, and you remember it was Congo, DRC, and so on, CAR, they all had bad civil war, and so did some of the others. But there was a significant incidence of civil war among the good performers, quite surprising to me. For example, Nepal, we all know, had a major civil war. Well, Iran, maybe not a civil war, but a war with Iraq. And Morocco's had persistent bits of civil war. And of course, in the poor performers, much more civil war. As far as the environment is concerned, generally the good performers do better on environmental protection. There are various indices of environmental protection, but worse on carbon emissions. So finally, to look at the success and failure, you really need to go behind that and say, well, all right, these are the outcomes. They did this, that, and the other, but why did they do it? What was the politics behind this success and failure? And I'll just go through a few countries in a very abbreviated form to try and understand that. I mean, Korea started by having a very strong autocratic government which put a very high value on education and industrial growth, and really was pushing for industrial growth and saw that education was needed for that. And that was very successful in terms of creating employment, in terms of exports, and in terms of advancing education. And in fact, so successful that you virtually had a full employment economy. At which point you move from having an autocratic government to a more democratic government, basically. But at that point, the workers had much more power than they'd had before, and they got together in a really powerful trade union movement, and they put a lot of pressure together with the democratic process to have the benefits of a welfare state. And so the second phase, the first phase was they did human development for the sake of growth. The second phase was that the politics of that type of economy was such that you had big pressure for a welfare state, as you have had in many other countries, and you had success. So if you'd come to Brazil, in the first phase, they got growth out of successful import substitution. There was a military government, and any human development progress was the result of, if you like, the employment created in the import substituting areas, and wasn't very great. But after the military came to an end and you had democratic institutions, you also had a major movement of workers and peasants who together formed a political party and instituted the Lula government, which put human development absolutely at the heart of its policies. So in that particular case, the chief thing to understand is why there was this movement of peasants and workers and coming together, and the democracy was very important for that, to allow this movement then to be translated into policies. Well, if we come to China, then I talked a little bit about China before, but during the peak of the sort of communist era, clearly health and education were given big emphasis. It was very equal income distribution and human development, apart from sort of major problems, obviously, with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Human development made progress. After the economic reforms, we find, and I'm sure this is a very familiar story, growth accelerates tremendously. There's a pullback on the human development expenditures, but the economic growth is able to reduce poverty enormously. And now we come to a sort of third phase, where we're beginning to get a sort of full employment economy, and there's beginning to be movements for rising wages, and that is likely to lead to continued advances in human development coming in a way like the Korean case, coming much more from below. Well, in Turkey, I I think a similar story to the Koreans, so I won't go right through it. But what is remarkable about Turkey is the huge rise in taxes in order to fund social expenditures, which was associated with the democratic era. Cambodia is a puzzle. I mean, Cambodia suffered a genocide and then civil war to 1991 and stabilized only in the late 1990s, and remains very weak on rule of law indices. In fact, they come 99 out of 102 countries. I think the Success in Human Development Index is due to a recovery from a really poor basis as a result of all the war and so on. And so one's not really looking at the politics of that, but the politics of post-conflict reconstruction. And then Cote d'Ivoire is an example of a poor-performing country, which was poor-performing well before it had a civil war. And it used to be compared a lot with Ghana, where it used to do, in the pre-Civil War era, Ghana was always less good on economic growth, but far better on health and expenditure. So that some of the figures are here in that graph. Secondary enrollment rate was just 10% in 1970 in Cote d'Ivoire, whereas in Ghana it was 43%. The infant mortality rate in Cote d'Ivoire was, in 65, was 184. In Ghana it was 122. So there was always a comparison with Ghana. Basically, it was a very elitist strategy that was followed in Cote d'Ivoire, followed by civil war. So it's hardly surprising that there has been failure. So having rushed through all this material, let me come to some conclusions. First of all countries made some progress in basic human development. I looked at the averages, but even if one takes every country made some progress, but the progress varied hugely. And success in the narrow or basic human development seems to be due to a combination of growth, distribution, and social expenditure and social priorities, but that combination varies across countries. There's not one combination that is essential. And of course, the combination chosen reflects the political systems and pressures and the economic structures and opportunities. The political system can be autocratic or democratic for success, but also it can be autocratic or democratic for failure. So it's not, the political system doesn't deliver either. Political system does deliver the space for movements to develop, which are going to put pressure on politicians to deliver human development. So you're lacking that space in an autocratic situation. On the other hand, the autocratic government might have its own reasons for wanting to advance human development, as in the push for industrialization in Korea. What we find is there's not much relationship between success and failure on human development and the wider dimensions of human development, including, as I've just said, political freedoms, but also including security and environmental sustainability. So let me end by just saying something about possible critical issues for the future. I think the overwhelming issue, as in most areas, is the issue of the environment and carbon emissions. And they need to be integrated in some form into the objective and into the policies and monitoring. And one may have to do this in a somewhat simplistic way, because, in a sort of sophisticated way, one ought to take them into account automatically, because human development shouldn't just be human development today, but it's human development over a long period of time, over the future. So if one is going to try and maximize human development, one should automatically take into account what's happening in the future as well. But that's a very complex thing to do, and it's something that we don't do. I haven't looked at the future at all. I've just taken the actual figures. So although theoretically that's the right way, in a way, to integrate the approach, it's not going to deliver, I don't think. So I think we're going to have to integrate the approach in a somewhat more simplistic way by discounting our present achievements by the carbon emissions that we are giving. And you can do that in a whole variety of ways. And people have done a lot of work on doing that with respect to economic growth, and we could do that to the economic part of, the income part of the HDI, or we could take the whole HDI and do something like divide by carbon emissions, something very crude. But I think we need to do that so as to take this issue seriously, because if we don't take it seriously, the success in human development today means absolutely nothing if it means that in the future we're going to make losses. Next issue is inequality in multiple dimensions, and that has become very much debated, particularly with respect to the economy, but it should be considered also with respect to human development, because there are a lot of inequalities in health access, education access, political freedoms, and lots of other things, so that it needs to be addressed. And one of the reasons it's not being addressed is, again, that there's a sort of disjunction between the things we look at and distribution. This is particularly in relation to the economy, because the economy and economists look at all the things that cause economic efficiency and macroeconomic stability and all those things, and without feeding in inequality. And if inequality is really to be an intrinsic objective, there are only two ways really of achieving it. One would be to have an economy which generates more equal distribution. The other is to have an economy which generates inequality, but have a tax system which then taxes us and brings us back to equality. And of course, you could have some combination. I think people are aware of the tax alternative, but then there are huge pressures against it. So it's nothing much is happening on the tax. We know what you have to do for taxes, but it doesn't happen because people say, if you have a high marginal rate of tax, everyone's going to move abroad, you're not going to get your growth. So the tax thing doesn't need so much work, it's a question of politics. The primary income distribution, why does the economy generate a particular distribution? That we are very weak on analysing. And one of the reasons is the whole nature of the way our productive system is organised, that we have a capitalist system which generates profits and so on and so forth, instead, for example, of a share economy in which everyone has an equal share of what they are producing, and that automatically generates a much more equal distribution. So we need to think much more radically about the nature of an economy which would deliver better equality. Then finally, a big issue is that of social cohesion, living peacefully with diversity, which obviously diversity is here to stay. We're not going to abolish diversity, and I think it would be a very bad thing if we did. But obviously many countries are struggling with the issue of living peacefully with it, and indeed democracy can lend itself to being anti-diversity and creating tension, because that's one way of getting short-term votes and so on and so forth. So I think that the major issue for those of us who work on human development is the issue of how to improve peaceful multicultural societies. Thank you. So we have about maximum 10 minutes for questioning if anyone wants to ask.
People could please come to the microphone in the center.
Hello. Thank you, Francis, for this very, very interesting overview, and you took us back in history and as well as the current challenges. My question relates to the high performance, particularly Saudi Arabia. And I remember in the 2010 Human Development Human Development Report on rethinking human development, the high performance were not just Saudi Arabia, but were also Libya and Tunisia, as well as Morocco, as you kindly pointed out, which again raises the issue about the extent to which political freedoms, when ignored, also affect the sustainability of the human development gains that, well, there hasn't been any Arab Spring in Saudi Arabia yet, but to what extent does the neglect of political freedoms in this good performance affect the overall long-term human development performance?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I don't think that I've really researched it, because the countries I've been looking at are ones which did manage to transit from very repressive regimes to more open regimes, and in so doing allowed human development to continue to flourish. And so that is very interesting. And if we looked at it, decade by decade, maybe we would find that. And you may well be right about Saudi Arabia for the future. It's a good point. Thanks.
Yes, I also would like to thank you for a very marvelous presentation, a lovely overview of human development the last 40 years. I have a question because thinking about particular countries that I know and looking at this framework, I'm wondering, with social expenditures, you put a lot of weight on that variable. And I'm wondering, do you make any attempt to tease out the political or the government efficacy or efficiency in delivering services in health and education, and whether that has to be factored in too for understanding these performances? Because I can think of great variation in terms of for X amount of millions of dollars spent in one country, it looks very different than spent in another country on help these social services, these social expenditures. So how do you deal with that complexity in a framework like this?
Yeah, it's a good point, because, well, if you take the education sector, people, the MDGs had an education goal which was widely met, but then it turned out when they did some tests that some of the children coming out of school couldn't even, write a sentence. So, what does this mean? And one really should look at it. I've never personally looked at that in that detail. What we have looked at is the extent to which the distribution of social expenditure, what is the distribution of social expenditure? Because you can have social expenditure which essentially is going, to higher education for rich people and not to primary education. So I've looked at that aspect. But on the efficiency aspect, I haven't personally looked at it, but I think it's something that is clearly relevant. What I'd say is that the fact that we find, obviously efficiency varies a lot across all these countries, and obviously equally, they're all pretty inefficient. But anyway, the fact that you do find that there is some relationship suggests that they're not doing it all wrong, that it's better than not having it. It would be better to have efficient social expenditure, but, even to have some. It sort of reminds me, if you look at female education, all the micro studies and also the macro studies show that when you have better female education, you have better child health. I haven't seen a single study that doesn't find that. Even though some of the quality of some of that education is absolutely lousy, and it seems to be, at least in this particular case, that it's just going to school and getting that sense of empowerment which seems to have an effect, even if it's very, very bad education. So a little bit maybe that it's a sort of empowering thing as opposed to actually what people learn. But I accept the point that one should go beyond that and look at the efficiency.
Thank you very much, Francis, for this really fascinating presentation. And I just have a small comment and a question. My comment is, I'm just wondering if this is a hint that you're going to write part 2 of your the 1997 book on the failures and successes of why countries fail or something. I'm forgetting the exact title, but that was a co-edited book that I've referenced often in my work. And my question is regarding the graph there was on the political freedoms and HDI. And I'm just wanting to refer to countries where there is political freedom relative to the countries that you have mentioned occur most on the graphs, and the HDI. You can probably might have guessed I'm referring to India, which was not on any of the graphs that you had. So whatever the reasons, but it does have political freedoms more than any of the countries that you had in that graph. But its HDI in many of the dimensions seems to be almost stuck over decades and decades. It's the stats on the home to the largest number of malnutrition children, the maternal deaths, and that continues, whatever the progress. So I'm just wondering how you might want to, what your views might be on that.
Yes. Yeah, well, obviously India didn't come out either on the top or the bottom. That's why we didn't talk about it. But you can do interesting work, and people have done, about different states within India. And actually, I've just been reading a paper about Kerala, in which apparently the strategy has changed very radically from one where you focus on the social to one where you focus on the economic growth. And this has apparently had dividends in terms of human development indicators as well. Yeah, what is the relationship between political freedom? I mean, I think India illustrates this sort of lack of relationship. If you have political freedoms, it gives rise to the possibility of strong social movements. And you do see some of these in India. So you have seen, you know, the right to food, which has had real dividends. You've had your employment movement, which resulted in the National Employment Guarantee Scheme. So you do see those happening. Now, maybe they're not happening on a sufficient scale, but you do see these happening. But then again, social movements have to overcome, and I think there's a real problem for multicultural societies. They have to overcome other differences in order for people to join them. And India, above all, has so many differences that makes it difficult for people to get all embraced in a single movement. So it's got handicaps in terms of that. But I would say that the social movements are a positive sign for what political freedom can bring. Yeah.
Right, this is just an institutional question, Francis, because you were a consultant on the Human Development Reports about the issue about integrating the environment. In the mid-1980s, I was writing a paper on human development and the environment, and I saw Meghna Desai's paper on greening the HDI, which is the first very crude attempt to do that. It was in background paper to the 1995 Human Development Report. And I remember writing a letter to the director of the HDRO suggesting that they tried to do this at that time. Sakiko was the director at the time, but I never spoke to her about this. And I've seen at least 2 reports giving various reasons why one shouldn't do that. And I've never been convinced by any of these reasons. One was that the data is too bad. Well, if the data was too bad, they shouldn't have had the HDI in the first place. So I'm just wondering if there was some internal kind of story about why they never pursued that path.
Well, I suggest 2 things. You asked this question in 2 different places today at this conference. You asked this question in the next session where Salim Jahan is here, director of the HDRO, and you ask Amartya Sen. And I think you'll get your answer.
You won't tell me.
No, I won't tell you. I think you should ask. Yes, I don't want to. Well, you can interpret from what I've said. Yes.
Well, I think we should
Can I?
break for the
Okay. Maybe just a quick comment. Just on the, you mentioned a lot of linkages between human development, political freedom, and other things. Absence of linkages or linkages. I was wondering, in your study, did you also look at the governance indicators? I mean, there is you mentioned something about rule of law, but I mean, corruption and others. So good governance, bad governance, rather than political freedom or lack of political freedom. Would that be more relevant in terms of HDI, looking at a relationship with HDI?
That's a good point, and it relates to what the earlier speaker said, and maybe it's something I should look at. I don't like the governance indicators. You know, I think what they count as good governance or bad governance, I don't necessarily think is right, but I think it would be good to look at it. I agree with you. So I'm happy to look at that. I haven't done it. Thank you very much, everybody.